Order, order. Blair McDougall to move the motion.
Thank you. I beg to move that the House has considered UK supply chains and Uyghur and Turkic Muslim forced labour in China. Thank you, Chair, for chairing today and for giving us the opportunity to highlight this issue. I also thank the Minister for being here today. In his last period in office and his sabbatical from this place, he was a consistent advocate for the dignity of people all over the world, and so I thank him for being here to respond today. Chair, that human rights have never been respected by the People's Republic of China is a given, but the persecution of Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims since 2017 has been unprecedented even for the Chinese Communist Party. More than 1 million Muslims have been imprisoned in an enormous network of camps. Possibly as many as 3 million out of a population of 11 million Muslims have made their way through the camps at some time. This is the largest mass arbitrary detention since the Second World War. Uyghur women face forced sterilisation, forced abortion, sexual violence within the camps, and forced marriage to Han Chinese men. Thousands of mosques have been demolished, hundreds of Muslim graveyards have been bulldozed, countless sacred Islamic shrines have been destroyed. Uyghurs are forced to consume pork, drink alcohol, and eat during the Ramadan fast. These crimes are part of a deliberate effort to destroy the Uyghurs as an ethnic group, a distinct culture, as a religious identity. International organisations and human rights groups, too numerous to list here, assess that crimes against humanity are taking place in Xinjiang, and this House of Commons has voted to recognise what is going on as a genocide. That is an intentional policy which seeks to destroy a people. All of what I've just said is context to discussing the issue of forced labour in Xinjiang, but it's important to understand that Uyghur Muslim slavery is not a byproduct of the attempt to destroy a people. It is an integral part of China's project. Indeed, as the camps were built, alongside them factories for forced labourers were constructed too. And for those not inside the camps, the threat of incarceration is used to coerce Uyghurs into the PRC's wider labour transfer programme. And Chair, there's a dark contradiction at the heart of all of this. These atrocities are happening in a region which is increasingly closed to those who would testify to the crimes, the journalists, the human rights groups who would document it, and of course those who would, if they could, flee to freedom. But at the same time as the region closes down, it's increasingly open to and integrated into the global economy. Xinjiang mines, refines and manufactures for the world. Some of the best-known global brands are profiting from the destruction of a people. The scale of slavery in the region is enormous and actually barely disputed. 4 years ago, official Chinese government documents acknowledged 2.6 million Uyghurs and other Turkic minorities had gone through labour transfer programmes. The scope of the industries impacted are too large to cover in the time afforded to us today, so it's necessary to focus down on a few areas that especially expose the UK's economy and risk consumers being unwittingly complicit in Muslim slave labour. So I'll focus briefly on clothing, cars and climate change. On clothing, Xinjiang produces a quarter of the world's cotton. The idea of hundreds of thousands of slaves working in cotton fields evokes an image from another era where we discussed slavery and forced labour. But this isn't a historical practice. It is a well-documented economic reality in the Uyghur region today. Happy to give way.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend Greenway, and I'm very grateful for him securing this debate and illuminating an issue that still too few in the international global order are willing or indeed brave enough to talk about. And I'm particularly, I think, will be, assure him that Muslim communities across this country will be particularly grateful to him for securing this debate also. I wonder if you will agree with me that as important as it is for us to be ethical about our own supply chains, given that we are a major global player in the world, that we should continue to double down on our efforts to persuade China's near neighbours to adopt the similar ethical approach as the honourable gentleman is espousing that we do.
I couldn't agree more, and I would also thank my honourable friend for the time he has taken to meet with me and Uyghurs from the UK and his concern on this issue. On that issue of cotton, it is highly likely that high streets around the UK are today selling goods made by Muslim slaves from Xinjiang. Brands like Primark, Next, Tommy Hilfiger, Ralph Lauren, Calvin Klein, Hugo Boss, Pull & Bear, Mango, Guess, Jack & Jones, Levi's, Burberry, Nike, Adidas, Puma and Max Mara. In my own city of Glasgow, I've identified 15 retailers in the famous Style Mile who stock brands who have been identified as being at risk of being implicated in Uyghur forced labour. And that same story is true of every shopping mall in the high street across the UK. The price of disposable fashion is Muslim forced labour. So that's cotton. Turning to cars. The automotive industry is also deeply compromised here. The steel used in cars, the aluminium, the electric vehicle batteries, electronics, tyres and spare parts all have chains stretching back to the Uyghur region and to companies which we know take part in PRC-mandated labour transfer programmes. Audi, Honda, Ford, General Motors, Mercedes-Benz, Toyota, Tesla, Renault, LEVC, the makers of electric London black cabs, Aston Martin, Bentley, Daimler, Jaguar, Rolls-Royce, all have been identified by researchers as having supply chains at high risk of being compromised by Muslim slave labour. And Chair, even if we were not appalled at the persecution of Muslims, the theft of children from their parents, the sexual violence, the sterilisation, even if we weren't appalled at the inhumanity of this, we should be angry as a nation at the economic unfairness of it. We cannot build our own manufacturing industries. We cannot create good jobs for our own people while competing with companies who have little or no labour cost. This government is building a new green energy future for this country, but we can't generate the green jobs that are part of that vision while competing against Muslim slave labour. And that brings me to the final point on climate. The primary material for the production of solar panels is polysilicon. The manufacturers of polysilicon in the Uyghur region use forced labour is not in dispute. Every single polysilicon manufacturer in the Uyghur region have reported their participation in labour transfer programmes or are documented as being supplied raw materials by companies who have participated in those programmes. More than a third of the global production of polysilicon takes place in the Uyghur region. So no company or public authority in the UK should be sourcing solar materials which originate in that region. However, a further third of global production of polysilicate takes place in other parts of China, with a high likelihood that those supply chains ultimately begin with Muslim slave labour. So I'm keen to hear the Minister today expand on the welcome pledge made by the Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero during the passage of the GB Energy Bill, that the Government is working to ensure that the extension of solar energy in the UK is not built on Uyghur forced labour. But I would argue that the real solution to this, the only real solution to this, given the Chinese dominance of this market, is an urgent international effort to develop alternative supply chains that, from quartz to panel, never pass through China at all. Mr Chairman, the measures in the Modern Slavery Act have not stopped companies from profiting from slave labour of Uyghurs and other Muslims in China. Nothing that I have said today is new. These are stories that have been splashed over the front pages and broadcast on television news. Shame, it seems, is not a greater motivator than the profit margin. Sunlight is not disinfecting, and legislation based on transparency and reporting alone is not getting the job done. Other nations in the EEA have gone further than us, requiring companies to conduct human rights due diligence of their supply chains. So I'd ask the Minister today whether it is time for legislation in the UK that emulates the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act signed into law by President Biden, a law that creates a presumption that any goods manufactured wholly or in part in the Uyghur region should be assumed to be the product of forced labour unless proven otherwise by clear and convincing evidence. And I recognise today that supply chains can be difficult to unravel, with exports often passing through multiple companies on their way into our economy. However, there is a direct freight flight from the Uyghur capital, Urumqi, to Bournemouth, bringing goods from the epicentre of forced labour in China. Yesterday, a flight for Urumqi arrived just before 7 p.m. Another will arrive on Friday and another on Sunday, and this will continue week after week. This is not opaque or convoluted. It is a clear and obvious route with a significant risk of those flights containing goods compromised by Muslim slave labour. So I'd ask the Minister today, finally, whether import inspections have been or can be carried out on the goods arriving from the freight flight into Bournemouth from Urumqi. Chair, after last night's election results in the United States, there will be much debate about the state of the global struggle between autocracies and democracies, between the strong men and human rights. I close by suggesting, as we look for that policy response, we can begin by ensuring that our own economies are not funding the worst excesses of such regimes. Thank you.
May I remind members that they should bob if they wish to be called, and only those here at the start of the debate will be able to speak. The question is that this House has considered UK supply chains and Uyghur and Turkic Muslim forced labour in China. Excuse me. Thank you. Jim Shannon.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, can I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak, and can I also thank the Honourable Member for East Renfrewshire for setting the scene so very well, with compassion, with understanding and with detail. There's not one of us in this House who are here today, and perhaps outside of this House, understand the issue very well. He's explained that, and I suppose at this stage with our request, we look towards the Minister, who I wish well in his position, and it's nice to see him back. And I do hope that he can give us some reassurance. I'm pretty sure that in this House today we'll all be one unanimous voice, all requesting the same thing. The Honourable Member also has to be congratulated on his unwavering support for the Uyghur people. As Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Freedom of Religious Belief, I feel it's not only my duty but also my responsibility, Mr. Chairman, to stand here today. So I speak on behalf of all those who face persecution on account of their faith, of their beliefs, or simply their right to exist, and that's really what we're talking about here, the right to exist. In recent years, the situation for the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province has intensified to such a level that it's almost incomprehensible to try and understand just exactly what is happening. International human rights organisations, survivor testimonies, investigative journalism have documented alarming reports. The abuses encompass forced labour, torture, arbitrary detention, cultural erasure, and much, much more. Since 2017, credible sources, evidential sources, suggest that up to 3 million Uyghur Muslims may have been detained in what Chinese authorities term re-education camps. E-education, what a terminology that is so wrong. Their detention camps are vast and reflect an industrial-scale operation, with detainees stripped of legal recourse, often held without charge, and separated indefinitely from their families. The Honourable Gentleman referred to children taken away from their mums and dads. That in itself must be incredibly difficult to try and deal with, not knowing where your children are or will you ever see them again. Disturbingly, reports indicate that detainees are forced to abandon their cultural practices and their religious observances under the guise of re-education. Many have been detained for so-called infractions, as minor as possessing the Quran or praying at home. Imagine being in prison because you were praying in your own house where nobody could see you, but somebody must have seen them, somebody must have told them. Such charges reveal, I believe, a policy not of reform, but of a deliberate and state-sanctioned erasure. An estimated 80,000 Uyghurs have been forcibly moved from Xinjiang province to work in factories across China under conditions, Mr. Chairman, that indicate forced labour. Investigations have implicated prominent global brands. The Honourable Gentleman has referred to many of them, Apple, Nike and Volkswagen, just for three, in benefiting from this exploitative system. These companies need to be accountable. It's not all about profit. It's not all about how much you can make for your shareholders or what you can do. It's about what's right. And human rights abuses are not right. And no company that does that should think they can get away with it. And we in the West should be able to make those companies who sell in the West accountable for that process. In 2023, a coalition of human rights groups urged their global supply chains to sever ties with any forced labour practices in Xinjiang province. Yet companies continue to engage in these transactions under opaque terms. In light of this, I'll ask some questions as I go through my contribution. Mr. Chairman, I ask the Minister, what measures is the government taking to enforce stricter import regulations to prevent products from these supply chains from entering the United Kingdom? The gentleman has given three times that they arrive in Great Britain. If we know the times they're arriving, then we need to be able to do something about that. It's essential that our economy does not implicitly endorse these abuses. I know the Minister and the Government will not do that, and I understand that, but we need to have action to follow up the words from this debate today. The surveillance infrastructure in Xinjiang province is one of the most technologically advanced in the world. Reports from 2022 indicate that companies like Hikvision and SenseTime have supplied facial recognition technology specifically designed to identify Uyghurs. My goodness, the levels that the Chinese Communist Party go to identify the Uyghurs is incredible. I don't begin to understand technology, Mr. Chairman. I'm a different generation, but I understand that it's wrong, and I accept that. The facial profiling extends beyond Xinjiang. It infiltrates public places, tracks individuals across the country wherever they may be. In a troubling parallel as well, the use of artificial intelligence by Chinese authorities has expanded to track behaviours that are deemed to be suspicious. My goodness, behaviours, what's that? Is it walking on the street the wrong side, or talking to somebody, bumping into somebody by accident? Well, what does a behaviour mean? And who decides what behaviour is incorrect in their opinion? From owning certain apps to communicating with overseas contracts. This digital repression is paired with a social credit system that penalises Uyghurs and other minorities for perceived infractions, curtailing their freedom of movement and their employment opportunities. So the Chinese state are actually taking over the very life and blood and breathing of the Uyghur people. Perhaps one of the most horrifying allegations to emerge in recent years is that of forced organ harvesting. I brought a debate some years ago, and I think it might have been back prior to 2015, I believe it may have been, about organ transplants taking place against the Falun Gong, another religious group. And there was a report that was done about it, that the Chinese government were doing organ transplantation on an industrial type scale. And they're at it again, only this time it's not the Falun Gong, this time it's the Uyghurs. So we really need to step up. The China Tribunal, which I referred to, was chaired by Sir Geoffrey Nice, found at that time credible evidence suggesting that the Uyghurs, alongside other minorities such as the Falun Gong practitioners, have been killed for their organs. They removed them on an industrial type scale, and total disrespect for those people who lose their organs. In 2022, the UN Human Rights Council called for greater transparency and accountability from China, demanding clarity of how organs are sourced. Despite these international calls, there's been no cooperation whatsoever from the Chinese authorities. No surprise in that, of course, from an autocratic state who doesn't believe in human rights, liberties, or the right to have your own religious views and to have some freedom. In light of these very grave allegations, again, I urge the Minister to adopt stronger legislative measures to prevent UK citizens from this country from engaging in transparent tourism. I understand in the past the previous government took some action in relation to that. I'd be very keen to hear what's been done and up to date perhaps and where we are. in relation to that. Another area of great concern is the extensive use of biometric and DNA data collection. Since 2021, every Uyghur in Xinjiang province has been required to undergo biometric registration, including facial scans, fingerprints, and even voice samples. My goodness. The mass data collection raises alarming questions about its potential uses. What's this for? Including heightened monitoring and suppression, entire suppression of an ethnic group. And with the rise of sophisticated AI-driven tools, these databases could further enable targeted repression. Repression is already there. This can make it even more subjective and even more violent and difficult. So again, I call upon government to press for an independent investigation by international human rights bodies and to seek accountability for the systematic abuse. Beyond physical oppression, there is an insidious campaign aimed at erasing the Uyghur culture, the language, the religion, their right to practice their religion as they so wish to do, a right that I uphold and support across this great world. Xinjiang's mosques have been destroyed or repurposed. My goodness, repurpose a mosque when its sole objective is to help to let people worship their God and follow their religious viewpoints as they so wish to do. Uyghur language schools shut down and traditional practices banned. In 2022, UNESCO expressed concern over the cultural genocide unfolding in Xinjiang province, yet China continues to stifle cultural expression with impunity. They seem to think they can do whatever they want and get away with it. I'm a believer, Mr. Chairman, they may in this world think they can get away with it, in the next world they'll be held accountable to God for what they do wrong. I'd like to see them be accountable in this world for what they do wrong as well, and get it in both places. So what we can do to make that happen would be helpful. This is not merely a matter of policy, it is a deliberate attempt to erase the people's identity, their history and their place within China's fabric. As a nation that champions, this great nation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, champions freedom of belief and cultural expression, the UK must continue to voice its condemnation. In 2023, the UN's Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights issued a detailed report condemning the abuses in Xinjiang province, describing the situation as crimes against humanity. Those aren't just words, Mr. Chairman. They explain very implicitly and very, very fully what it means to be a Uyghur Muslim in China. Numerous countries have since imposed sanctions against Chinese officials involved in these abuses. Can I ask the Minister, have we done likewise where we're able to do in relation to it? And however, the UK's response has been measured. We've got a new government. We have an opportunity to do it better, I believe. And I do look towards the Minister and to our government to do better if we can. I call on government to consider imposing Majinsky-style sanctions on individuals and entities proven to be complicit in these abuses. We must today in this debate send a very clear message that the United Kingdom will not tolerate human rights violations by any power in this world, no matter how great they think they are. Because I believe in a God that can strike those people down. This is a call to action. The horrors faced by Uyghur Muslims must not be met with silence or passive disapproval. But its government has an opportunity, indeed I believe a responsibility, to stand with the persecuted, to uphold justice and to affirm our commitment to human rights. I conclude with this, Mr. Chairman. The Chinese government are guilty of genocide. The evidence is enormous. The cries of the Uyghurs and the Turkic Muslims has to be addressed, and the Chinese Communist Party and all those involved made accountable. So I urge the Minister, on behalf of this House, to address these issues with clarity, with conviction and, above all, a steadfast commitment to justice. The world is watching, Mr. Chairman, and history will remember how we responded to this dark chapter and a role that we play. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to thank my honourable friend for calling this important debate and also for setting the scene, the tragic scene, so well at the beginning of his remarks regarding the appalling human rights abuses occurring in Xinjiang against Uyghur and Turkic peoples, abuses perpetrated on a really unimaginable scale, which are crimes against humanity and which this House clearly resolved form part of a genocide. I also want to pay tribute to honourable members who've been speaking out and speaking up on this issue and are suffering the consequences from the Chinese state in terms of sanctions and other effects as well. Many people in this place are familiar with the dreadful situation in Xinjiang, but I suspect very few outside of this place realise how complicit many companies are in their use of supply chains that involve forced labour. And these supply chains touch on many industries, as my honourable friend pointed out earlier, but I want to focus on the automotive industry. Sheffield Hallam University, the Helena Kennedy Centre, which I commend, has done lots of research on this matter and has documented clearly the links between the automotive industry's supply chains and forced labour in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Their claim, as profound as it is harrowing, is that anyone in the UK who has bought a new car in the last 5 years will have benefited from a product that was produced with forced labour. The Chinese government, the university found, has deliberately shifted, raw materials, mining and processing and auto parts manufacturing into the region, making international supply chains captive to repressive programmes and systematic forced labour. Their investigation found massive and expanding links between Western car brands and these abuses in everything from hood decals and car frames to engine casings, interiors and electronics, to the very raw materials involved. A combination of weak enforcement of forced labour laws and the government's perceived blind eye to environmental standards in China in the past, paired with convoluted supply chains, has left this industry reliant on abusive suppliers. Every car brand, Volkswagen, BMW, Honda, Ford, Mercedes-Benz, Toyota and Tesla, is at risk of sourcing from companies linked to these abuses. And as my honourable friend pointed out, it's not just cars. These issues permeate many other sectors, with Sheffield's Forced Labour Lab finding links between the cotton, garment and solar panel industries using forced labour. There is some light. In September this year, the Court of Appeal removed certain legal barriers to investigations into businesses suspected of profiting from alleged forced labour in China, but that was after the National Crime Agency had formally declined to investigate companies accused of importing cotton into the UK that might have benefited from forced labour. So this is just the tip of the iceberg, and we have to go further. Companies themselves need to conduct thorough reviews of supply chains down to the raw materials with their procurement teams and suppliers removing themselves from contracts with companies who have engaged in the use of forced labour. And the only way to ensure that a company is not sourcing forced labour-made goods is not to buy anything from suppliers that are willing to use forced labour anywhere in their operations and to take a risk-averse approach where there is any chance that that might be the case. The government, I think, should consider enacting and implementing mandatory human rights due diligence laws. We heard earlier about some of the legislation and regulation being passed in the United States, in recognition that abuses can easily be distanced from direct suppliers under state-controlled economic systems. Forced labour import bans are a necessary complement to mandatory human rights due diligence, especially where state-sponsored repression effectively prevents companies from conducting the on-ground assessments they would usually do around forced labour risks. So if companies in the government adopt robust and thorough mechanisms to look at their supply chains, eventually we will see divestment from firms who endorse this state-sponsored repression and send a clear message to the Chinese Communist government that their treatment of Uyghurs and Turkic peoples is wholly unacceptable. And it's been pointed out before that we have a key role in the international community, Chair. We are a leading industrialised country, a member of the G7, and people will look to us to set an example in how we approach these affairs. And I think in the best British tradition, we should be upholding human rights in every sphere that we can. Thank you.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to work under your chairmanship for the first time this morning, Mr Dowd. May I first of all thank my colleague for calling this essential debate. Now we have a Labour government. We have an opportunity to review our trade and diplomatic relations with nations, not least with China. We know that many goods exported from China have used forced labour by the Uyghur and Turkic Muslims to manufacture goods, not least in the solar, electrical vehicle, cotton and seafood industries. Absent from the last Parliament was a human rights approach to trade. Labour has an opportunity to reset our trade policies our international relations and to ensure that countries who exploit labour know the consequences of this. We must not stand by when Uyghur and Turkic Muslims are exposed to slave labour, torture and re-education programmes. As the Minister will know, I have been challenging the UK's approach to trade with China, from the harvesting of organs and to the use of forced labour. I have sought to amend the Medicine and Medical Devices Bill and the Procurement Bill. Over the last few years, the UK legislation has fallen behind developments in the supply chain, and our laws need to be urgently enhanced to protect the human rights of others. Such crimes must be upheld against the standards set in international courts, and were found wanting, sanctions taken. I call on our government to clean up the supply chain and to ensure that the abuses perpetrated by China are held to account. Britain has been a soft touch, and now we need to be in touch with the reality of these atrocities. The evidence is there from The Hague to inside reports, and these crimes are being committed. Today, it is estimated that 40% of UK's solar industry and 5% of the world's solar-grade polysilicon supply and 97% of the world's solar panels could contain polysilicon made in the Uyghur region of China. This is credibly reported to be at risk of association with Uyghur forced labour. As Labour progresses its green energy sprint, it is vital that clean energy means clean procurement. Similar breaches can be exposed in the batteries in electrical vehicles. Will the Minister introduce a presumptive ban on Xinjiang imports akin to the US Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act, where unless a business provide clear and convincing evidence that goods sourced in Xinjiang were not made with forced labour, they will be prohibited? We further need to review our modern slavery legislation. Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act needs to be more robust, and therefore, please can we review this so companies and their supply chains can be held to account? And should companies be in breach of cleaning up their supply chains, then significant penalty should be applied to the perpetrators. However, we need a serious trade framework which makes it explicitly clear that the UK will cease all trade if there are traces of forced or slave labour. The abuse that has been reported from Uyghur and Turkic Muslims is a very significant breach of the values of our country and our government, and we must seek to lead the way to ensure that our trade restrictions are the freedoms for the Uyghur and Turkic Muslims. Mr Chairman, it's less than 16 hours ago since I sat and listened to two Falun Gong people, a woman and a man, here in the Westminster Hall, in G Room last night. The lady had been imprisoned in Xinjiang over 20 years, taken in, got out, taken in, got out, years tortured. She's now here in this country, and I listened to her. It was harrowing. It was horrifying. A younger man was there. He'd been in a number of times and escaped. Got out. I've met a doctor in living in this country now who escaped. He didn't know what the scar was he had until he was taken into hospital for something whilst over here. He was found part of his kidney, part of the lung had been extracted, and there was no point of what was taken from him. He was a prisoner. They were all Falun Gong. What is happening to Uyghurs now is what has happened to Falun Gong. Since we started looking at this and raising things in the UK, the UN Office of High Commissioners in 2022 concluded that violations in the region may constitute international crimes, in particular against humanity. The UK Parliament voted on April the 22nd in 2021 to recognise these atrocities as genocide. Since then, Beijing has renamed hundreds of villages and towns, continuing the effort to subsume and eradicate any Uyghur culture. New regulations are enforced which further restrict religious practice. Volkswagen and Shein have come under heavy pressure for continuing to source from the Uyghur region with attendant risk of supply chain slavery. Many internment camps have been abandoned since 2023. Information from the region is scarce, but it would be accurate to suggest that the persecution has not ceased. Rather, there appears to be a move away from internment into labour camps, towards larger numbers imprisoned, 1 in 26 Uyghurs. The extraction of organ harvesting, it says at age 28. It is that 3 organs will survive. They're taken from these young men while they're alive because they stay. They're more successful. They're fresh if they're taken from live bodies. That is what happens. That is what happens in organ harvesting. In April 2022, the Health and Care Act came into force, introducing significant reforms in the administration and delivery of health and care services in England. Section 47 of the Act mandates a comprehensive review by the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care to assess the potential risks of slavery and human trafficking within the NHS chain. The recent review undertook by NHS England and NHS Supply Chain Coordination Limited scrutinised 1,361 suppliers, 30,000 encompassing 600,000 products, 30,000 cotton-based items, approximately. The review revealed that 21% of UK health procurement is categorised as being at high risk of involvement with slavery. Solar industry, 40% of UK solar industry is credibly reported to be at risk of being tainted by Uyghur forced labour. Inadequate laws on public procurement, it just needs to be sorted out. Falun Gong is near the end. Even in this country, it's international, the hounding of those people. A woman was left lay on the floor outside our British Museum. No one went near her. No police came, nothing. We're having further investigations into that. We've had the police in stations in Manchester. This is all about controlling Muslims, different categories of Muslims, different trends, slight changes. We can all practice our religion or practice none, if we so wish. What steps will our Minister and our government take to ensure that Great Britain stays clean or cleans itself up and ensures that people can live in other countries and not be persecuted for the cheap return of labour? And all this is about keeping the Communist Party in China. That's what it's all about. Communist Party in China, along with the Communist Party in Russia. We are in a dreadful situation in our world. We really must step up in this Great Britain, our country, and our government cannot allow us to drift along, as will happen if we don't step up soon. I thank you.
Clive Jones.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be under your chairmanship, Mr Dowd, and I congratulate the member for East Renfrewshire for securing a debate on such an important topic. And it's good to see the Minister here, and I look forward to working constructively with him in the future. The Liberal Democrats welcome the Court of Appeal overruling the National Crime Agency's decision to not launch an investigation into whether high street brands are using forced labour in the Xinjiang province of China. I congratulate the Global Legal Action Network and World Uyghur Congress on this success. Importantly, in the short term, the ruling now means that the National Crime Agency need to seriously consider its decision to not carry out an investigation, because with 19 billion units of clothing being produced in China yearly, it is not unbelievable that much of this is produced by detainees in Xinjiang. The Global Legal Action Network say there is an abundance of evidence that UK companies import cotton made with forced labour from China, and that 85% of Chinese cotton is grown in the Xinjiang region. Let there be no confusion. Slavery is not an issue of the past. Today, almost 50 million people are trapped in slavery worldwide. That is why the Liberal Democrats are calling on the government to reverse the Conservative Party's rollbacks of modern slavery protections and to introduce legislation obliging retailers to guarantee full traceability of their supply chains, ensuring ethically sourced materials, decent livelihoods and safe working conditions in the products that we buy. My constituents in Wokingham do not want to buy clothes that are the result of forced labour, but they simply do not know where it is sourced from. And so retailers need to be forced to take action, to review their supply chain and to take due diligence seriously, because we should not allow evil to profit from British consumers. We should not let genocide be simply a means of reducing a company's profit margin. We are better than this. I'd like to focus on this word genocide for a moment. In 2020, the world discovered that the Chinese government treatment of the Uyghurs was more widespread and systematic than previously known. Forced sterilisation, destruction of religious sites, torture, detainment in re-education camps. The appeal judges themselves in the National Crime Agency ruling stated that there was a diverse, substantial and growing body of evidence that human rights violations are taking place in the region. These horrific acts found in Xinjiang have been described in different ways, with the UN concluding that China's actions would constitute crimes against humanity. The Liberal Democrats agree with Sir Geoffrey Nice, KC, when his independent tribunal found that the Uyghurs are being subjected to genocide by China. Specifically, these actions constitute a genocide based on the description of genocide laid out in Article 6 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Liberal Democrats believe that the government need to be explicit in their condemnation of these actions as being that of a genocide. And in recognising this, we need to champion human rights and support survivors, and support the Uyghur and the Turkic people who are being persecuted simply for their beliefs. The Liberal Democrats are calling for the government to issue a comprehensive China strategy which places human rights and effective rule-based multilateralism at its centre. My colleagues and I will continue to stand up for people's human rights across the globe, to protect, defend and promote human rights for all, including those persecuted for their religion and belief. Liberalism and cooperation have a vital role to play in securing peace, promoting democracy and defending human rights across the world. The UK must work with the global allies to ensure the end of the persecution of the Uyghurs and Turkic people. The UK must introduce a general duty of care for the environment and human rights in business operations and supply chains to guarantee no human is being taken advantage for a piece of clothing. And so I would ask the Minister if they will support the Liberal Democrat policies laid out in my speech, and if they will agree with the following. Will the Minister back a Magnitsky-style sanctions on persons and entities involved in the persecution of Uyghurs and the Turkic people under the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2018? Will the Minister ensure that the UK grants asylum to those fleeing genocide? And to reiterate, will the Minister be explicit in their condemnation of the actions of the Chinese state of being that of genocide? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dowd, and I suspect that this will be the final time that I speak on behalf of His Majesty's official opposition in an international trade debate. And following the events across the Channel overnight, it's possible that there may be an alternative vacancy in government that means that the Minister may be moving on before too long as well. But if this is the last time that we face each other, can I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for the courtesy that he has showed me during my brief time shadowing him. It has been greatly appreciated. And I'd also like to join other members in congratulating the Honourable Gentleman for East Renfrewshire in securing this important debate, a debate on an urgent and deeply troubling issue that affects not only our values and our moral standing as a nation, but also the integrity of our supply chains. The systematic forced labour of Uyghur and Turkic populations in China's Xinjiang region. The evidence is clear and undeniable. Reports indicate that over 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities are detained in camps, facing conditions that are nothing short of abhorrent and genuinely disgraceful, subjected to forced labour under the watchful eye of a regime that seeks to erase their identity and their culture. The situation is not just a distant tragedy, it is intertwined with our own economy and our own lifestyles, affecting the very products that we import, that we buy, and that we consume here in the United Kingdom. We have long recognised the importance of aligning our trade policies with our commitment to human rights. Our strategy for UK-China relations has been built on 3 pillars: protect, align, and engage. This approach has driven us to strengthen our national security protections, deepen collaboration with our allies, and engage with China where our interests converge. The previous government introduced measures to make sure that British organisations, both public and private, are not complicit in or profit from the human rights violations in Xinjiang, including a review of export controls as they apply to Xinjiang to ensure the government is doing all it can to prevent the exports of goods that may contribute to human rights abuses in the region. The introduction of financial penalties for organisations here in the UK who fail to meet their statutory obligations to publish annual modern slavery statements under the Modern Slavery Act. A new, robust and detailed guidance to UK businesses, setting out the specific risks faced by British companies with links to Xinjiang and underlining the challenges of effective due diligence there. And a minister-led campaign of business engagement to reinforce that need for UK businesses to take action to address the risk. We have led the international community in condemning China's gross human rights violations. In March 2021, we imposed sanctions on key officials involved in these abuses, acting alongside 29 other countries. Furthermore, we were the first nation to lead a joint statement at the UN condemning these violations back in 2019. And of course, Just this year, we've done so again, this time with a record-breaking 51 signatories. These actions demonstrate our unwavering commitment to holding China accountable that I know is being continued by the new government. In 2023, our updated public procurement rules were designed to mitigate modern slavery risks, ensuring that no taxpayer money inadvertently supports these violations. We have also introduced strict measures under the Procurement Act to exclude suppliers involved in labour market misconduct, further reinforcing our commitment to ethical sourcing. However, it is essential to recognise that while we have made significant strides over the previous years, huge challenges remain, particularly in how businesses engage with entities that may be complicit in these gross abuses. Sadly, the situation with fast fashion companies such as Shein raises enormous concerns, and the company has been widely criticised for its alleged links to forced labour in Xinjiang, yet we see troubling ties emerge between the current government and companies like Shein. It is deeply concerning that the Chief Executive of Shein has recently been engaging with senior figures within the Labour Party. This raises uncomfortable questions about access and influence within government, when we should all be standing firm against human rights abuses. While we've taken decisive action, we cannot allow our progress to be undermined by those who seek to profit from this exploitation. As has been said, the European Union has taken a proactive stance against companies like Shein. This disparity between the EU's action and our own lack of action highlights a critical point. We must be unequivocal in our commitment to human rights, free from the taint of associations that contradict our values. The implications of forced labour in our supply chains extend beyond ethical concerns. They pose serious reputational risks for the businesses and threaten our trade relations around the world. We have a responsibility not only to protect the rights of the Uyghur and Turkic populations, but also to safeguard the integrity of UK businesses. Companies that choose to engage with suppliers linked to forced labour rightly risk facing a backlash from consumers who demand accountability and transparency, and it is our role to make that accountability and transparency easier. So I have just 5 questions that I'd like to pose that I hope the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Minister, might address in his response. Firstly, before the election, Labour promised to formally declare what is taking place in Xinjiang as a genocide. Is that still the government's intention? And if so, did the Foreign Secretary raise that intention with Wang Yi during his recent visit to Beijing? Secondly, when does the government plan to launch the international legal action against China on Xinjiang to get that formally declared on an international level as a genocide, as they promised before the election? Thirdly, how does the Energy Secretary's decision to sign off on 3 enormous solar farms, some of which involve companies that have been judged to be the most complicit in human rights abuses, how does that sit with the government's commitment to remove the produce of forced labour from UK supply chains? Fourthly, will they introduce measures to ensure that the UK doesn't become a dumping ground for slave labour-made solar panels, as both the United States and the European Union have already done for their own markets? And finally, has the Minister met with Uyghurs and Turkic Muslims and their representatives as his department develops its China audit? As we move forward, all UK businesses must conduct thorough due diligence to ensure that their supply chains are free from forced labour. It is imperative that we renounce any friendly or commercial ties with entities engaged in or linked to forced labour. We must remain steadfast in our commitment to human rights, standing alongside those who were persecuted in Xinjiang, ensuring that we do not profit at their expense.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I would like, first of all, to congratulate my honourable friend on not just his recent election, but securing this important debate this morning. I feel obliged to perhaps declare an interest in paying that compliment, given I have known, campaigned with and long admired the political judgment and moral seriousness of the new member for East Renfrewshire. I know quite how dearly he holds that title as a local representative of that community, but I think what we witnessed today in his remarks evidence not only that he will be a doughty local fighter, but has the kind of global perspective and moral conscience that well serves this House. I would also like to thank all of the others who have participated in our debate today. I think it was genuinely a debate worthy of the seriousness and urgency of the matters under discussion. I would therefore like to thank the Honourable Member for Strangford, who spoke with characteristic passion and clarity this morning in his advocacy of the need for urgent action. I will endeavour to return to the specific points that a number of members have made, but let me just offer a few brief introductory remarks before going into more detail. My honourable friend, the Honourable Member for Macclesfield, brought to the debate careful research, in particular on the car industry's risk of sourcing goods produced through forced labour, and my honourable friend, the member for St Helens South and Whiston, made the case with passion and with force that clean energy must not mean procurement that is secured through slave labour, an approach to which I wholeheartedly agree. And I'm grateful to her in particular for sharing what were frankly the deeply harrowing accounts of those that she's had the privilege of meeting in recent days, and bringing that perspective and understanding to our debate this morning. The Honourable Member for Wokingham, the Liberal Democrats' new frontbench spokesman, spoke with characteristic eloquence and raised a number of points I'll seek to address in the course of these remarks. And finally, can I thank the Honourable Member for Kingswinford in South Staffordshire for his gracious words. With no disrespect to his remarks, I sense there are much bigger issues at play this morning than the future prospects of either of us on either side of this debate. Now, it was 2 years ago that the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights that released its assessment of the situation in Xinjiang. This concluded that clear evidence has been found of serious human rights violations, and that the scale of the arbitrary and discriminatory detention of Uyghurs and other largely Muslim minorities within Xinjiang, and I quote directly, may constitute international crimes, in particular crimes against humanity. Multiple other bodies and independent human rights experts have since taken similar views, relying extensively on China's own records. These findings and recommendations detail evidence of large-scale arbitrary detention, family separation, as we heard very eloquently from the member for Strangford, enforced disappearances, forced labour, systemic surveillance on the basis of religion and ethnicity, severe restrictions on cultural, religious and linguistic identity, torture, sexual and gender-based violence, including forced abortion and sterilisation, and the widespread destruction of religious and cultural sites. This government is therefore deeply and sincerely concerned about these human rights abuses, and we continue to work with international partners to find ways of effectively holding China to account. Last month, the UK signed an Australian-led joint statement at the UN Third Committee. This called on China to uphold its international human rights obligations, implement United Nations recommendations, release individuals arbitrarily detained in Xinjiang, and allow access to Xinjiang for independent observers to evaluate the human rights situation. While, as my honourable friend suggested, sunlight is not sufficient, transparency is nonetheless essential, and we therefore want those independent advisers and observers to evaluate the human rights situation. The United Kingdom has also undertaken direct action against those who have aided or abetted these activities. Back in 2021, the United Kingdom, of course, under the previous government, announced sanctions against 4 Chinese officials and 1 entity based on compelling and widespread evidence of serious and systemic human rights violations in Xinjiang. The Government also conducts independent visits to areas of major concern where possible and continues the delicate but vital work of supporting NGOs in exposing and reacting to human rights violations. More widely, this Government is carrying out a comprehensive audit of the UK's relationship with China, as we've discussed this morning, to improve our ability to understand and respond to the challenges and opportunities that China poses in today's world. Work on the audit is ongoing and will inform the Government in setting out a long-term and consistent approach towards China. It was put to me as to whether this was being led by the Department of Business and Trade, and were we therefore meeting with the Uyghurs in DBT. That actually is an audit that's being led out of the Foreign Office, but I can assure the honourable gentleman that efforts are being made to ensure that voices are heard as part of what is this comprehensive audit being taken forward. For this work, engagement with China is vital, not only to cooperate on shared challenges, but to challenge on areas, frankly, where we disagree. Both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary raised human rights in their introductory discussions with President Xi and Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and the Foreign Secretary raised human rights with Wang Yi again in Beijing last month. The Foreign Secretary has also called on China to lift the unwarranted and frankly wholly unacceptable sanctions on UK parliamentarians, a matter to which I will return. This will remain a top priority for the Government. I would now like to address some of the specific legislative and regulatory measures this Government and the Department uses to address forced labour before coming to some of the specific questions that colleagues have asked. This work is a vital part of this Government's efforts to ensure business does not use forced labour or cause or contribute to other human rights abuses and violations within their supply chains, no matter where they operate in the world. The UK addresses forced labour, as many colleagues know, in global supply chains under Section 54 of the 2015 Modern Slaveries Act. This requires commercial businesses who operate in the UK and have a turnover of £36 million or more to report annually on the steps they have taken to prevent modern slavery in their operations and supply chains. The purpose is to provide transparency where businesses monitor their supply chains with rigour, are open about their risks and mitigations, listen to their workers and act where they do find issues. We've also taken action in the new Procurement Act to strengthen the rules around excluding suppliers linked to modern slavery. A number of colleagues asked, given our commitment to clean energy, whether that would be at the cost of the integrity of our approach to procurement, and I can give honourable members that assurance. For instance, the Act expands the mandatory exclusion grounds which apply if a supplier or a connected person has been convicted of certain offences under the modern slavery legislation. Suppliers can be investigated for debarment on modern slavery grounds and may be placed on a central debarment list of suppliers who must or may be excluded across the whole of the public sector. In addition, my department takes a number of steps to address forced labour within UK supply chains. We negotiate and implement forced labour and modern slavery provisions within our free trade agreement programme. The Developing Countries Trade Scheme allows for the suspension of preferential trading arrangements, specifically on grounds of serious violation of labour rights. And the UK Export Finance also reviews environmental, social and human rights risk factors for transactions in scope of their policy responsibilities. Furthermore, our overseas business risk guidance makes clear to UK companies the very risks we've been discussing today of operating in certain regions and urges them to conduct appropriate due diligence. The UK Government expects, encourages and supports UK businesses to undertake that due diligence so that human rights and environmental issues are considered in their operations and supply chain relationships, in line with the OECD guidelines on the responsible business conduct and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. With respect to supply chain due diligence legislation, which has been raised in our debate today, the UK maintains a regular dialogue with the European Union, following the recent passage of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and this Government continues to review how we in the United Kingdom can best tackle forced labour and environmental harms in supply chains moving forward. We also regularly engage with business and international partners on both domestic and international tools to combat forced labour. Our Trade and Forced Labour Business Roundtable allows for businesses and government to come together, speak frankly, and gives the opportunity for Her Majesty's Government to understand how we can frankly better support businesses than has been the case in the past in their efforts to combat forced labour within supply chains globally. This package of policy tools goes some way to addressing the concerns that have been raised today, but I can assure the House there is absolutely no grounds for complacency. In line with the Sustainable Development Goal 8.7 and the commitments that have been made through the G7, which was referenced earlier, this government is committed to ensuring no company has forced labour within its supply chain. With this in mind, we continue to consider actor-agnostic measures that would improve worldwide supply chain transparency and traceability. We are aware, however, that some sectors are at higher risk of forced labour within their supply chains. We've had a number of contributions that have focused on the issue of solar supply. On solar supply chains, this government is committed to tackling the issue of Uyghur forced labour, including the mining of polysilicon, about which the member for East Renfrewshire spoke so eloquently, used in the manufacture of solar panels, and is therefore taking robust action. The Solar Task Force has been relaunched by this government and will specifically be focusing on identifying and taking forward the actions needed to develop resilient, sustainable and innovative supply chains that are free from forced labour, to support the significant increases in deployment of solar panels needed to meet that ambition of which we've discussed this morning, to increase UK's solar power capacity by 2030. On cotton and on auto supply chains, about which a number of members have also spoken, we have also been clear that no company in the UK should have forced labour in its supply chains, and as I've already set out, there are rules in place to compel companies to publish statements demonstrating they've met their legal obligations on modern slavery. Let me seek to address some of the other specific questions that have been raised by members in the course of the debate. The Honourable Member for Strangford spoke in relation to the trafficking of human organ harvesting. That is simply a heinous crime and deserves our complete and unequivocal condemnation. This government is determined to stamp this out. It is a form of exploitation by catching the perpetrators and safeguarding the victims. There are a range of offences under the Modern Slavery Act 2015 and the Human Tissue Act 2004, which have been extended on the 1st of April 2024, ensuring perpetrators are held accountable and leaving no room for this crime to go unpunished. In relation to the Honourable Member for Strangford's further question in relation to sanctions, I've spoken in general terms about the approach that the government is taking, so let me be somewhat more explicit. China's sanctions are completely unwarranted and unacceptable. This issue will remain a priority for the government, given the integrity and importance of our democratic legislature here in the House of Commons. The Foreign Secretary has called on China to lift the sanctions in meetings with his Chinese counterpart, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, at the ASEAN meeting in July and during his most recent visit to Beijing on the 18th of October. The sanctions announced by the UK on the 22nd of March 2021 against 4 Chinese officials and 1 entity were based on compelling and widespread evidence of serious and systemic human rights violations in Xinjiang. While 30 countries were united in sanctioning those responsible for these violations, China's response was simply to retaliate against its critics. In relation to the position on genocide that was raised by the Honourable Gentleman from Wokingham, and indeed by a number of colleagues, it is the long-standing policy of the British government that any judgment as to whether genocide has occurred is a matter for the competent national and international court rather than for government or non-judicial bodies. But regardless of any court's decision, this government will stand firm on human rights, including China's repression of Uyghurs and others in Xinjiang. This includes raising our concerns, as I've already suggested, at the very highest levels of the Chinese government and coordinating efforts with our international partners to hold China accountable for the actions that they have taken and to account for human rights violations. For example, as I mentioned, just on the 22nd of October, forgive me, the UK joined Australia's statement on China's human rights situation at the UN Third Committee. On the issue of whether the UK will issue sanctions against perpetrators, those who have been accused of having forced labour in their supply chains, we do keep all evidence and potential listings under close review. It is frankly not appropriate for me at this dispatch box to speculate on who we may designate in the future, as to do so could reduce the impact of those designations, but I've listened carefully to the points that have been made in the course of the debate this morning. In relation to the question of will we impose stricter regulations that have been raised again by the Honourable Member for Strangford and indeed by the Member for East Renfrewshire, the United Kingdom recognises the importance of ensuring that businesses are not complacent in the issue of forced labour and human rights violation, and I can assure the Honourable Gentleman that we will continue to assess and monitor the effectiveness of the existing measures about which I have spoken today, alongside the impact that other countries' measures are having, to reach a view as to what is the appropriate approach to tackle forced labour effectively. In relation to the point raised by my honourable friend, the Member for East Renfrewshire, specifically on the GB Energy and solar approach, I've spoken already in terms of the Solar Task Force, and I hope that that has given some comfort. We are working, frankly, with good colleagues across government on this issue, and the government is united in its determination that the Solar Task Force, which has been relaunched to develop sustainable supply chains, will of course give due consideration to this issue. The Solar Stewardship Initiative will also support the delivery of that solar roadmap. The Public Procurement Act, however, also applies to strengthen rules around existing suppliers linked to modern slavery. In relation to other issues that have been raised, I can assure the House that across all sectors of the economy, we will continue to work with business and international businesses to ensure that their supply chains are diverse, resilient and, of course, free from human and labour rights abuses. One final point that I should seek to address as well, which was the specific issue raised by my honourable friend, the Member for East Renfrewshire, in relation to direct cargo flights for Urumqi to Bournemouth. The Border Force does not assess whether goods on freight entering the UK may have been using forced labour. However, this government, I can assure the honourable member, is committed to working with partners to ensure that we can best tackle forced labour in supply chains, and will, as I said, continue to assess and monitor the effectiveness of the steps that we have taken and will continue to take. The government will continue to assess emerging policy tools such as import bans introduced by international partners to understand their effectiveness in tackling forced labour in supply chains. This includes operation of the US's measures, about which a number of members spoke, and the implementation of the EU's forced labour regulations to better understand potential impacts here in the United Kingdom. If I was to seek to summarise the sentiment and the approach that the government is taking, I find that we are in broad agreement with the points that have been raised, both on the character of the crisis that we are facing in relation to forced labour and a sincere and genuine desire to address these issues. The United Kingdom is, thankfully, still a leading voice in international efforts to defeat modern slavery and end human and labour rights abuses in both public and private sector supply chains. Going forward, we will continue to assess the most effective ways to continue to address these issues. We will continue to stand firm, I can assure colleagues, on human rights, including in Xinjiang, where China continues to persecute and arbitrarily detain Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslim minorities. This includes raising our concerns at the highest level of the Chinese government. We've already done that with both the actions of the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister, and coordinating our efforts in international fora such as the G7 that was mentioned to identify, expose and hold China to account for serious and systemic human rights violations. Mr Chairman, I would again like to thank you for your service to the House today, to the honourable friend, the Member for East Renfrewshire, for raising this important and urgent topic. And going forward, I would like to assure him and indeed this Chamber that this government is sincerely committed to tackling these issues. We will continue to work to ensure UK supply chains are free from forced labour and continue to speak out against human rights abuses, no matter where we find them.
Thank you. Blair McDougall to wind up.
Thank you, Chairman Dowd, for the opportunity to close this debate. I thank so many honourable members, first of all, for speaking up on behalf of the dignity and humanity of Uyghurs and other Muslims in this situation. And I also thank them, I think, for not using sanitised language in describing what is going on in the Uyghur region, which I was potentially guilty of myself. You know, we talk about labour transfers when we're really talking about slavery. We talk about sexual violence when we're talking about women being raped. We talk about the education centres when we're really talking about concentration camps, and we talk about the removal and transfer of children when we're talking about state kidnapping. And I particularly want to thank the member for Strangford. In the short time I've been in this House, I think I've been in the room with him countless times when he's spoken up on behalf of religious freedom. And I think he made an essential point in understanding the nature of what is happening in Xinjiang is that it is religiously motivated. He mentions the small infractions that people can end up in the internment camps for. And I would add to the things he said of, you know, having a beard, going on pilgrimage to Mecca, simply travelling to another Muslim country is enough to find yourself in these camps. And I think sometimes in politics, the word Orwellian is used, and it's sort of become a sort of hyperbolic cliche that we turn to. But when we're talking about what's happening in the Uyghur region, I don't think there is another word that is more appropriate to describe what's going on. The stories I have heard of people phoning home to their relatives on FaceTime or video calls to find a uniformed Chinese state security person answering their relatives' phone. The stories of AI being used to identify particular ethnicities. The collection of DNA, the collection of biometric information on millions of people. And I mention all of that because I think the traditional approach to forced labour and due diligence is almost impossible to imagine that working in a circumstance where the oppression of people is so intense and so all pervasive. And often when we debate human rights issues in this chamber, the causes and the intent are a matter of nuanced debate. And I think when it comes to the situation with the Uyghurs, it is incredibly clear what the intent is, and it's incredibly clear what the plan is and what the motivation is for what's going on here. And my honourable friends from Macclesfield and from St Helens South and Weston both hit the nail on the head here. This is about the political and economic power of China. That is what is driving this forced labour crisis here. And the longer it continues without being challenged, the deeper the problem becomes. In the debate, others have spoken about this is pervasive into the cars we drive, the clothes we wear. It's also in the food we eat, whether it's tomatoes or often seafood as well. And our moral complicity in it grows. But also the longer this goes on, our own economic ruin grows as well, because as I said earlier on, we cannot possibly compete with industries which have no labour cost. And so some of this is about international action as well as the action of individual ministers. We know that authoritarians are increasingly organised, and those of us who do believe in the rule of law and do believe in basic standards in these issues have a responsibility to pursue the same multilateral actions. And the member for Wokingham and others today named and shamed some of those companies who are involved in this process. But I think the awful truth is some of these companies are literally shameless. They are more motivated by the bottom line than they are of their public reputation in the international opinion. And can I thank the Minister for showing such moral clarity? I know that when you have to, as of course all governments have to work with China, given their economic power, to hear such clear and unambiguous condemnation of the attacks on Uyghurs as he gave is so important. Because from my time working with Uyghurs, they feel so often forgotten and unheard. Because so many of the things which honourable members have spoken about today, which happen to them, happen unseen. But today we've shown that they're not happening unheard, and I think that's incredibly important. So I welcome in particular, he used the word innovative in terms of the approach to supply chains, which, as I say, I think is essential given the dominance of China in the polysilicate matter. And I also welcome his commitment to continue to assess, monitor and learn from the approaches other countries have taken, and he knows that myself and other members will continue to press him to do that at speed. And can I close finally by paying tribute to those who, at considerable risk to themselves, ensure that the story of what is happening in Xinjiang escapes what is an increasingly closed society. The Uyghurs who have lost contact with their families, who risk imprisonment when they travel, the civil society organisations such as Anti-Slavery International, the World Uyghur Congress, who do this work. Because, as I say, Uyghurs so often feel forgotten, and if this debate has done one thing today, it's shown the world that we won't forget them and that they will have a voice within this Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you. The question is that this House has considered UK supply chains and Uyghur and Turkic Muslim forced labour in China. As many as that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. Thank you.